The Sherman's ammunition rack was empty except for one round. The radio was dead, and somewhere in the smoke 2 miles away, a German Panther was systematically destroying everything that moved. Comment below where you're watching from and what time it is there. Staff Sergeant Michael Holbrook had been a tank commander for exactly 11 months, and he'd learned something that no training manual ever mentioned. In armor warfare, you don't die from what you can see. You die from what you don't see until it's too late. The Panther they were hunting had killed 6 American tanks that morning without anyone getting a clear visual on its position. That's the kind of mathematics that keeps you awake at night, the kind that turns experienced crews into statistical casualties before they even know they're in a fight. It was March 17, 1945, and the U.S. 3rd Armored Division was pushing through the Rhineland, that industrial corridor of Western Germany where every factory town became a fortress and every road junction turned into a killing ground. The German army was collapsing, everyone knew that, but a collapsing army can be more dangerous than an advancing one. Desperate men with nothing to lose make tactical decisions that seem insane until they work. The town of Durnau sat in a river valley, population maybe 2,000 before the war, now just rubble and smoke. The strategic value was minimal, just another waypoint on the road to Berlin, but the Germans had left behind a blocking force, not enough to stop the American advance, but enough to make it expensive. And somewhere in the hills overlooking that valley, a single Panther tank had turned a routine mop-up operation into a bloodbath. Let's talk about what made the Panther so terrifying. When German engineers finalized the design in 1942, they created what military historians still consider one of the most lethal medium tanks ever built. The Panther mounted a 75mm WK-42 L-70 gun, which sounds modest until you understand that this wasn't your standard 75mm. The barrel was 70 calibers long, meaning it was 70 times the width of the bore, and that length translated directly into muzzle velocity. The Panther's main gun could launch a 15-pound armor-piercing round at 3,068 feet per second. At 1,000 yards, that shell could penetrate 140 millimeters of armor plate set at 30 degrees. For context, the frontal armor on an M4 Sherman was 64 millimeters. The Panther could punch through a Sherman from the front at 2 miles. A Sherman could only penetrate a Panther's front armor if it got within 300 yards, and even then, only from specific angles. This wasn't a fair fight. It had never been a fair fight. The American advantage in armor warfare wasn't technical superiority. It was numerical superiority. The U.S. could field 5 Shermans for every Panther Germany produced, and in the brutal mathematics of attrition, 5-to-1 odds eventually work in your favor. But that's cold comfort when you're one of the 5. Holbrook's Sherman, designated C7 and nicknamed Creeping Death by a gunner who'd been killed 3 weeks earlier, was an M4A3 E8 model, what the crews called an Easy 8. This was about as good as the Sherman got. Upgraded suspension, wider tracks, better gun stabilization, and most importantly, a 76mm gun instead of the original 75mm. The 76mm could actually hurt a Panther if you got lucky and hit it in the side or rear. Front shots were still basically suicide, but at least you had a fighting chance if you could maneuver. The problem this morning was that there was no maneuvering. The Panther had positioned itself on high ground overlooking the valley, somewhere in the hills to the east. Every time an American tank pushed into the valley to search for it, the Panther would fire once, maybe twice, and another Sherman would brew up. Then the Panther would reposition slightly, just enough to avoid counter-battery fire. The German commander knew exactly what he was doing. By 900 hours, 6 Shermans were burning in that valley. 6 crews, 30 men, dead or wounded or running for cover through open ground under machine gun fire.
The battalion commander had pulled everyone back and called in artillery. But artillery is imprecise at best, and you can't shell an entire hillside without knowing where your target is. Meanwhile, the entire advance had stalled. 3,000 men and 60. That's when Holbrook's crew got volunteered for what everyone was politely calling a reconnaissance mission. What it actually was, bait. Drive into the valley, get the Panther to reveal its position by shooting at you, and hope you survive long enough for the battalion's artillery to bracket the location. Holbrook had been around long enough to know that hope you survive was doing a lot of heavy lifting in that plan. His crew consisted of 4 men besides himself. Private First Class Danny Ortiz on the bow machine gun, Corporal James Jimmy Reardon as the gunner, Private Eugene Parks as the loader, and Sergeant William Grant as the driver. They'd been together since Normandy, which in tank crew terms meant they were ancient. Most tank crews got rotated out or killed within 2 months. Holbrook's crew had somehow lasted 8. They rolled into the valley at 0945 hours, moving slowly, scanning the hills. The smart play was to stay buttoned up, hatches closed, safe inside the steel cocoon. But buttoned up, you're half blind, relying on periscopes with limited fields of view. Holbrook rode with his hatch open, head exposed, because he'd rather risk a sniper than miss seeing the Panther before it fired. The valley was maybe 800 yards wide, relatively flat bottomland that had been farmland before the war. Now it was just mud and shell craters and the burning wrecks of 6 Shermans. The hills on either side rose about 400 feet, covered in a mix of bare trees and rocky outcroppings. Perfect terrain for a defender, nightmare terrain for an attacker. The Panther could be anywhere in those hills, and from that height it had a perfect view of everything below. They made it halfway across the valley before Jimmy Reardon's voice cracked over the intercom. Movement, 2 o'clock. Elevation. Range estimate, 1,800 yards. Holbrook swung his binoculars right, scanning the hillside. For a moment he saw nothing, then a tiny glint of reflected light, there and gone. Could have been sunlight on metal, could have been nothing. Then he saw it again, just a shadow moving behind a rocky outcropping, maybe 100 feet up the hillside. Driver, reverse, full speed, Holbrook ordered. But even as Grant was slamming the transmission into reverse, he knew they were too late. You don't outrun physics. The Panther's round was already in the air before they could react. The first thing Holbrook learned about being shot at is that you hear the impact before you hear the gun. The speed of the projectile means it reaches you before the sound wave does. The shell hit them low on the left side, 15 pounds of hardened steel moving at 3,000 feet per second. It didn't penetrate, the angle was wrong, but it didn't need to. The kinetic energy transfer alone was enough to throw the entire 33-ton tank sideways like someone had hit it with a giant hammer. Inside the turret, Jimmy Reardon was thrown against the breech of the 76mm gun hard enough to crack 2 ribs. Eugene Parks went down in a heap, ammunition scattered everywhere. Holbrook, exposed in the commander's hatch, nearly got thrown out of the tank entirely. Only his death grip on the hatch rim kept him inside. Grant had the Sherman in full reverse, engine screaming, tracks chewing mud, putting distance between them and that firing position. They made it maybe 200 yards before the second round hit. This one struck the front glacis plate dead center. 64 millimeters of armor versus 15 pounds of armor-piercing death. The physics weren't in their favor. The shell punched through. What happens when an armor-piercing round penetrates a tank is difficult to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. The shell doesn't just make a hole, it creates a supersonic pressure wave inside the crew compartment. A shock wave that bounces off every surface at 5,000 feet per second. Metal fragments and spalling, pieces of the armor itself, spray inward like shrapnel. The temperature inside the tank spikes to several hundred degrees in the fraction of a second. And if the round happens to hit ammunition or fuel, the whole thing becomes a crematorium. They got lucky. The round penetrated just below the bow gunner position, missed Eugene Parks by maybe 3 inches, and buried itself in the transmission housing. The transmission was destroyed, fluids and metal fragments everywhere. But they weren't on fire, and everyone was still alive. Grant fought the controls, but the tank wasn't responding. The engine was still running, but without a functioning transmission, they weren't going anywhere. "Transmission's dead," Grant reported, voice tight. "We're immobile." Immobile. In tank warfare, that's another word for dead. A tank that can't move is just an expensive stationary gun platform, and stationary targets don't survive long. "Jimmy, can you fire?" Holbrook asked. "Turret traverse is still working," Reardon said, wincing from his broken ribs. "Gun's operational, but we've got a problem, Sarge." "What?" "We're down to 1 round." Holbrook felt his stomach drop. They'd started the mission with 71 rounds of 76mm ammunition. Between the morning's fighting and a resupply issue the night before, they'd been running lower than usual. Now, after 2 Panther hits had scattered ammunition all over the crew compartment, only 1 round remained secure in its rack.
One shell, one chance, and the Panther that had just crippled them was somewhere up in those hills, approximately 1,800 yards away, probably repositioning for a kill shot. Range to last known position? Holbrook asked. Jimmy checked his optics. Call it 1,900 yards, maybe 2,000, and he's moving. 2 miles. The effective range of the 76mm gun was listed as 2,000 yards against area targets, maybe 1,500 yards for precision fire against armored targets. What they were looking at was beyond the weapon's designed capability, a shot that the manual said was impossible, and they'd get exactly 1 attempt. "Talk to me about wind," Holbrook said. "East to west, maybe 10 miles per hour, temperature about 45 degrees. Humidity looks high from all this morning rain." All of this mattered. At extreme range, everything matters. A 76mm armor-piercing round weighs 15 pounds and leaves the barrel at 2,600 feet per second, but it's not a laser beam. Gravity pulls it down. Air resistance slows it down. Wind pushes it sideways. At 2,000 yards, that shell would drop approximately 120 feet from point of aim and take almost 3 seconds to reach the target. 3 seconds for the Panther to move. 3 seconds for the wind to push the round off course. 3 seconds where 1,000 variables could turn a perfect shot into a miss. And they had 1 shell. "Can you hit him?" Holbrook asked, and he hated himself for asking because he already knew the answer. "Honestly, Sarge? No." Jimmy's voice was flat, professional. "That's beyond max effective range. Even if I compensate perfectly for drop and wind, we're talking about a target maybe 20 feet wide moving behind cover at 2,000 yards. The margin for error is 0. "But can you hit him?" Jimmy was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Yeah, I can hit him." This is what separates veterans from rookies. A rookie would have said no, would have wanted to wait for support, would have followed doctrine. A veteran understands that sometimes doctrine doesn't apply. Sometimes you just have to make the impossible shot because the alternative is sitting in a disabled tank waiting to die. "Eugene, load the round," Holbrook ordered. "Jimmy, find me that Panther." The loader, hands shaking slightly from adrenaline, retrieved their last 76mm shell and slid it into the breech. The familiar clang of the breech closing was the loneliest sound Holbrook ever heard. 1 shot. Everything depended on 1 shot. Jimmy Reardon was 23 years old and had been a gunner for 9 months. Before the war, he had worked in his father's machine shop in Pittsburgh, a job that required precision and patience. Those same skills translated to tank gunnery. He understood angles, understood trajectories, understood that the difference between life and death often came down to fractions of an inch. He put his eye to the gunner's sight and began scanning the hillside, looking for movement, looking for any sign of the Panther. The German commander would be repositioning, moving to a new firing spot to finish them off. Standard tactics. The question was where? "There," Jimmy said suddenly. "Northeast, bearing 045, range 2,100 yards. He's moving behind that rock formation." Holbrook looked but couldn't see anything. At 2 miles, even through binoculars, a tank looks like a dark smudge. You see movement more than details. "You sure?" Holbrook asked. 60% sure, maybe 70. It's the right position for a follow-up shot. High ground, clear line of sight, partial cover. If I was him, that's where I'd be. 70% sure. In a fair world, that wouldn't be good enough. But this wasn't a fair world, and 70% was better than sitting still and waiting for a 75mm shell to turn them into scrap metal.
"Take the shot," Holbrook said. Jimmy made his calculations, range 2,100 yards, target moving left to right at approximately 5 miles per hour, wind from the right at 10 miles per hour, shell drop at this range approximately 130 feet. The gunner's sight had range markings, but they only went to 1,500 yards. Beyond that, you were guessing based on experience and instinct. He elevated the gun barrel, cranking the elevation wheel up, watching the angle climb. Too much and the shell would sail over the target. Too little and it would impact short. At this range, a 1-degree error would translate to 40 feet of miss distance. "Traversing right," Jimmy said, swinging the turret slowly, the electric motor whining. He led the target, putting his crosshairs where he estimated the Panther would be in 3 seconds. Then he adjusted for wind, moving the aim point another few feet right. The entire crew was silent. Grant sat motionless in the driver's seat, even though there was nothing he could do. Ortiz gripped his bow machine gun, useless at this range. Eugene Parks held on to the turret wall, watching. Holbrook stood in the commander's hatch, binoculars raised, waiting. Jimmy Reardon was 23 years old and hands steady on the controls, eye pressed to the gunner's sight, made one final micro-adjustment. Then he squeezed the trigger. The 76mm gun roared, the recoil slamming the breech back, the muzzle blast kicking up a cloud of dust and smoke that obscured everything for a moment. Inside the turret, the noise was deafening even with headphones. The entire tank rocked backward from the recoil. Then, silence. 3 seconds. That's how long it took the shell to travel 2,100 yards. 3 seconds. That felt like 3 hours.
Through his binoculars, Holbrook watched the hillside where the Panther had been. He saw nothing. Then, exactly where Jimmy had aimed, there was a flash of light, the unmistakable signature of a penetrating hit on armor. A moment later, smoke began billowing from behind the rocks. "Hit!" Holbrook shouted. "Direct hit!" The crew erupted in cheers, but Jimmy Reardon just sat there, eye still pressed to the sight, watching. After a moment, he said quietly, "Confirmed kill. Target is burning." Later, after they'd been recovered by the battalion and were sitting in a field maintenance area, watching mechanics tear apart their wrecked transmission, Holbrook asked Jimmy how he'd made the shot. "I didn't really think about it," Jimmy said, wincing as a medic wrapped his cracked ribs. "I just knew where it needed to be, like lining up a drill press back in the shop. You get a feel for it after a while." The intelligence officer came by that evening with information they'd gathered from the hilltop. The Panther they'd killed had been commanded by Oberlieutenant Klaus Richter, a veteran tank commander with 9 confirmed kills. The Sherman's 76mm round had struck the Panther's turret ring at a slight angle, a 1 in a million shot that had penetrated into the crew compartment and detonated the ready ammunition. The entire German crew had been killed instantly. The intelligence officer also confirmed the range, 2,180 yards, just over 2 miles, the longest confirmed tank versus tank kill in 3rd Armored Division history. They gave Jimmy Reardon a Silver Star for that shot, though the citation didn't mention it was their last round. Holbrook always thought that detail should have been included, because it mattered. Anyone can make a good shot when they've got unlimited ammunition and time to adjust. Making a perfect shot when you only get one chance, that's something else entirely. The crew stayed together for another 6 weeks until the war ended. They never talked much about the shot after that first night, the way soldiers don't talk about things that should have killed them but didn't. But every one of them knew they'd been present for something impossible, a moment where skill and desperation and pure luck had aligned perfectly. In the end, that's what combat comes down to. Not the dramatic moments or the heroic charges, but rather the quiet calculations made under pressure, the impossible shots taken because the alternative is worse, and the thin line between success and disaster that exists in every decision. Jimmy Reardon made a shot that the manual said was impossible, with 1 shell at 2 miles against one of the best tanks Germany ever produced, and it worked. Because sometimes, when everything else has failed and you're down to your last option,
The only choice is to aim carefully and pull the trigger. The mathematics of desperation don't care about odds or doctrine or what the manual says should be impossible. They only care about results. And that day, in a muddy valley in Germany, with a disabled Sherman and a single round of ammunition, the results spoke for themselves. The impossible shot had found its mark.